أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله القائل إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيبنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه وأما بعد. Beloved brothers and sisters who are watching, peace be upon you. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for joining us this evening on this first night of Jum'ah in the month of Rabi al-Thani on the Islamic calendar. As advertised, we have a special and very pertinent discussion to have about the movement to free our Imam Jamil Al-Amin. May Allah preserve him. And before we bring on the two speakers who will discuss a little bit more about his history and also his case and the movement to free him right now. But for those of you who have heard us speak about not only the issue of Imam Luqman Abdullah, who was killed unjustly by the FBI back in 2009, but even prior to that, when we've talked about the targeting of the Muslim community at Kaira, Michigan, we've always made reference to Imam Jameel, at least since I've been the executive director, about the unjust treatment that he's faced, and also how his case, we can say, is a part of Cointelpro 2.0, which is a continuation, really not abrupted program that's been implemented by the federal government that has targeted human rights leaders, civil rights leaders, and those people who were promoting change in society in the world that goes against the ideas and the machinations of certain people who are in positions of power. So with that, I'd like to bring on our two speakers who will be doing most of the talking. I won't be doing much this evening, but we have Brother Attorney Kaira, who is the son of our Imam, Hafidhullah Ta'ala, may Allah preserve him, and also Sister Maha, who's attorney and serving as counsel, legal counsel for our Imam Jameel, Hafidhullah Ta'ala. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
Thank you very much for coming on and engaging us in this blessed night. And besides our hope and our prayer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that this is part of an effort and counted as a means of working towards his freedom, but we also hope and pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, despite your personal relationships with the Imam, that it is counted in both of your mizan hasanat, that this talk is counted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and is heavy in your scale of good deeds. And we pray to Allah Azza wa Jal that it's a means of you both coming closer to the light of Al-Habib Al-Mustafa Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. And with that, I think it's most appropriate in this discussion that we start with you, Attorney Kaira, since you are his son, and of all of those people I could think of besides your mother, who I had first heard speak about the Imam. You are the second person in the family over the years that I've seen, at least online, speak about the history of your father, as well as his case. But I'd like for you, please, to give us a little background about our Imam, since perhaps there's some people who've watched who maybe the first time they heard about Imam Jameel was maybe in the recent Time magazine article that came out. And that's facts, because some people in our community wasn't even hip to the Imam really until they read about him in Time magazine. Bismillah.
Alhamdulillah, shukran. Assalamu alaikum, first and foremost. I want to, give my thanks and gratitude whenever we get an opportunity to do one of these events. It's a blessing. And even if we reach one person who hasn't heard of this situation and it touches them and moves them to action, then it's worth it. I spoke to my father actually earlier today and told him that I was doing CARE Michigan. So he told me to make sure to give my salams. And we were talking backstage about Imam Luqman. And, anytime I speak, I try to remember to mention him because, I was very close to him as well. And he was instrumental in kind of keeping things on the road for us as a family. He would drive down to Atlanta and just to check on me. So, that situation is near and dear to our heart. And we're sad that our situation trickled in and played such a major role in what happened with him. But I'll definitely allow you to elaborate a little bit further on that discussion. As for who the imam is, I've been telling people over the last few years that my relationship to the man is with Imam Jamil more so than A. Trap Brown. But it's funny because over the course of those 3 years, I've learned so much about him as A. Trap Brown through, these talks with different folks who we've had on who had different perspectives into him. And it just bolstered my opinion of him as far as activists go. I say he's everyone's favorite activist. The only reason we haven't had the opportunity to celebrate him in that way is because of this case that we're currently dealing with. Their goal was to bury his legacy. And that's why this Time magazine article, which I have here, and if you haven't grabbed it, I don't know if this is the cover where you are in Michigan, but this is what it looks like on the inside. This Time magazine article was huge for us because it opened us up to such a large demographic that to this point has been very difficult to tap into. When it first came out, a thought came to me that, when I first started this, it was hard to get community members to say the imam's name. And now we have Time magazine publishing an article on him in a positive light. So, it's a huge blessing. But yeah, no, he started his activism really because of his brother Ed, who was in school up in Howard, moving with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And so my father left Southern University in Louisiana to go and visit my uncle, and then just never went back. He decided, okay, cool, this is my calling. From there, he became kind of like he was the frontline activist. So anytime there was a need for someone to be somewhere because of violence, or there was a march or there's a protest, he wasn't speaking hundreds of miles away. He would get there and be on the front lines with the people where they needed him. And that translated into his Islamic activism and organization, from his communities within his Jamaat. Anyone needed him, they know if they called him, he'd be in the car on the road overnight to be where he needed to be to take care of situations. But it wasn't just his Jamaat. When Bosnia was protesting the genocide, he was there. When there was a genocide in Darfur, he was a major mouthpiece for them as well. And so, he became a humanitarian as opposed to just a Black activist on the backs of his Shahada, which in total Islam just gave him kind of the rubric for which to apply his activism, or I like to say militancy because they done made that a bad word, but I feel like it's still positive. But he it gave him direction in his activism and made him realize that it's bigger than Black folks, even though our plight is the worst. So we probably need the most assistance when other people needed assistance. He was no longer hesitant in providing it. And so that's why at this point where we are in his situation, we're happy that he's finally starting to gain that assistance in return when he needs our help. And so, in a nutshell, that's Imam Jamil. But what I'd really, really like for everyone to do is read the article online, and or if you can, go out and purchase it on newsstands, because getting it in Time magazine was step number one. They monitor the sales, they monitor the clicks on the website, they monitor how many people are going to their Instagram and looking at it over there. If we don't show up and show out, so to speak, that follow-up piece that we won't necessarily come. They won't be as excited. But alhamdulillah, we've been doing our job. I've been getting positive feedback from the author, who is a friend of mine. So, just keep it up. But if you haven't grabbed one, grab one, because inshallah it'll be a collector's item for when he steps out, and it'll be remembered as a pivotal step in this process.
Alhamdulillah. And yeah, we at Care Michigan, we actually emailed out that link, and we have it under the advertisement on Facebook as well on YouTube. I just shared the link again for those of you who are in the chat on Facebook or on YouTube. And I suggest that you click on that and get a little more information about the man, Imam Jamil Al-Amin, previously known as H. Rap Brown. Give you a little information about his impact, even like on myself and my family. My father used to go to Central High School, that was right across the street from Temple Number One, or Mosque Number One under the Nation of Islam. And before going over to the temple, um, he had actually participated in the march when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. marched in Detroit along with labor leaders, and where he first gave the I Have a Dream speech before he gave it in Washington, D.C. Many people don't know that he actually had given that similar speech in Detroit, in Motown, Motor City, before he gave it in D.C. Um, my father then heard Malcolm speak, rahmatullahi alayh, and then he also heard your father speak as well. At the time, he's H. Rap Brown. And again, if we want to use that term, militancy, Dr. King's message and what it was at that time was too, as he said, it was too bourgeoisie for him. So my dad was rolling with Malcolm, and then rolling with your dad back in those days, which he later ended up being involved in protesting a number of things here, as well as apartheid in South Africa, and took me overseas with him took me with him overseas when I was young, and I actually met with people who were part of the ANC while it was designated as a terrorist organization. But a lot of that influence that hooked me up to my to what I do today is part of the isnad, or the chain of connection of my dad, from my dad connecting back to your dad and Malcolm. So I just wanted to lift that up. That it's I have that connection, inspiration that my father talked about your dad and his influence on him, going back to, I think I remember it probably going back to my days in elementary school, probably.
Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. Um, so, Sister Maha, I know you're legal counsel for the Imam, but if you could, Attorney Kyrie gave a little background about his father, but I think it's also important to know that even before this particular uh, bogus conviction that he's incarcerated for right now, the imam was targeted before, right, by the government. I mean, he was under Cointelpro monitoring, but even the feds tried to throw a bogus charge on him before, when he was in Atlanta. So if you could kind of like elaborate the viewing audience on that and bring them up to speed, kind of like on the history of like how he's been targeted by the FBI. And we talk about conspiracy theories. Well, there are real conspiracies. So I don't want people to try to like push things aside. So, oh, that sounds like a conspiracy theory. Well, there are real conspiracies, right? So, and there's a real conspiracy at play right here. So, inshallah, if you can elaborate for us a little bit.
Yeah, of course. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu salam ala Rasulullah. Okay, so Imam Jamil was targeted. This goes back to the 1960s and his involvement with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and then his involvement ultimately with the Black Panther Party, and in the liberation of Black America, and meeting with President Lyndon Johnson. So we can go on and on and on with his involvement in the civil rights movement, which then led to his involvement in human rights activism as a Muslim. But essentially, COINTELPRO was a program developed by J. Edgar Hoover in the FBI to target African American men who, and I'll use the language from the movie Judas and the Black Messiah, from the actual rise of a Black Messiah. And there were several Black male leaders that were targeted specifically by name. H. Rap Brown was in these COINTELPRO documents specifically named, alongside Malcolm X, alongside Stokely Carmichael and the likes. Even Dr. King was listed, right? So they were targeting Black men that could move people, that advocated for the rights of African Americans at that time. It didn't stop there, though. I mean, this targeting went into the 70s, even as he became Muslim and moved away from the Black Power movement. He spoke truth to power. He was fearless in his approach. He was fearless in advocating for the oppressed. And with that, he can move the masses. So he was essentially, it wasn't just one time. Yes, there was that one arrest in Georgia, but there were several. He was targeted several times. Anytime that they can call him in, anything that happened on the West End, he was targeted. His family was targeted. Even there were points where, you know, he was held at gunpoint and there was a child in the car with him. So this was his life from the 60s until he was picked up well through the 90s and into 2000 with his ultimate incarceration. This was an ongoing process. So essentially, COINTELPRO, it was August 1967. It was a counterintelligence program against Black nationalist hate groups, quote unquote. And again, it was 3 men specifically in this 1967 document. It was H. Rap Brown, Stokely Carmichael, Elijah Muhammad, Maxwell Stanford were specific targets of that program. So essentially, he was targeted throughout from the 60s into 2000. And apparently, this was the one that stuck. You know, it was like charge him, and this was the one that stuck.
You know, as you were talking about COINTELPRO and some of the things that have been ongoing, and I was thinking about how our leaders, and particularly Black men, have been historically targeted by the government, and also we have to also remember there were journalists that were working on behalf of the government as well, like with COINTELPRO, to not only erase positive stories about leaders, but to even there were negative things that were fed about particular people. But I was just thinking about how Allah Azza wa Jal mentions in the Quran in more than one occasion about the plot of Pharaoh, Fir'aun, that he says, and kill the males and spare the women, right? That this is a tool, a Pharaonic tool of trying to stop a Messiah or a leader that can rally the people, that has the spiritual trait of charisma, that has moral courage, that can rally the people and lead them forward, right? And this is when I think of what's taken place to the Imam, may Allah free him of his unjust incarceration. But what's happened to so many of our leaders, this is really a out of the playbook of Fir'aun. And I always encourage here, that at least for the Muslims, that when we look at these things going on, we don't divorce ourselves from revelation. We don't divorce ourselves from the Quran, that the Quran gives us similitudes and gives us direction on all the things that are going on right now. So we need to understand literally who we're dealing with. We're dealing with something that is Pharaonic in nature. Brother Kairi, if you can just walk us through, this actual last particular case that's led to your father's incarceration, and kind of the atmosphere of the trial. And actually, I remember the entire trial, and then how the actual the whole situation, and how it being in close proximity to 9/11. And I didn't believe he was going to get a fair trial to begin with, but once the trial date came down after that whole thing with now, I said, "Oh man!" I'm like, they're really trying to like, this is really messed up right here. I didn't think that he had any shot of really getting a fair trial based upon how things were stacked up. But if you can kind of walk the viewing audience through that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I'll do the best I can. I was 12 at the time, so I was a young fella. I didn't even really, I don't think I understood the magnitude of the proximity to 9/11 that the trial, that wasn't even on my mind until many, many years later when I kind of, was old enough to digest those things properly. But aside from that, the environment it was strange. We knew and never believed he did it, and so therefore our belief was that we were going to win, like all the way up until all the way up until we heard the verdict. We believed he was going that we had won the case. We didn't believe that there was ever a point where they had proven anything, and anyone who was there on a consistent basis felt the same way. But there was a lot of collusion and strange behavior going on between the judge, the federal government, to the point where the feds and the judge closed the courtroom for a little while before we were to interview one of our witnesses who was a federal agent. And the reason for closing the courtroom was to detail the questions that we weren't allowed to ask before we came back in. The judge baked brownies for the jury. It was all kind of weird things going on. And so even as a child, I understood that the fix was in, so to speak. But again, in watching the presentation of the evidence, I literally took the bus from school every day to the courthouse. So I was there every day of the trial. And so I was able to watch the presentation of the evidence. Even then, I felt like I was pretty intelligent, or intelligent enough to understand that nothing was proven. And to this day, we're still fighting that fight to prove to people, firstly, that nothing was proven, and then to prove to the folks who are currently reviewing that at the very least, he deserves a new trial, but at most, he deserves his freedom. But yeah, no, that 9/11 situation made things 10 times harder because there was almost no way for him to have a jury of his peers without Muslims being on the jury at that point. African American was no longer enough because he's an outspoken, outwardly dressed Muslim whose garments looked very much like what was being blasted across the TV as the enemy of America. And so whoever you put in that jury pool, black, white, or otherwise, if they didn't have Muslim sentiments, then they probably had anti-Muslim sentiments. And that definitely made things a lot more difficult.
Is there anything else you'd like to add on, Sister Maha, about that particular proceeding?
Yeah, I mean, do you want me to go through some of the evidence, kind of bullet what was wrong with that trial? There's infinite errors in the trial.
Yeah, go through some of it, like how Imam Jameel doesn't even fit the description of the
Yeah,
actual
okay.
that
So,
the stature, eye color, go run us through
okay,
that.
right. So essentially, number one, there's and maybe I'm jumping ahead a bit, but there is a man who has confessed to this crime, right? So there were two officers that were shot. One of them survived, and the other one passed away. So it's a homicide. A law enforcement officer died, and it's an unfortunate situation, right? Nobody wants that. But the bottom line is that there's a third party who has already confessed to this crime. Otis Jackson consistently confesses. He's confessed in writing multiple times. He's confessed with a sworn affidavit. And most recently, he's confessed under sworn testimony in a separate trial in another situation where Kyrie, I know you have it. If you go to what happened to the number 2 rap.com, you can actually watch Otis Jackson give that confession in detail. And the thing about Otis Jackson is he's consistent over 21 years. He's consistent about what happened. He can give you the details. He'll tell you that his, monitor, his electronic monitor, he was out on probation or on parole, and he was being monitored. His ankle monitor malfunctioned the day of the incident. He was later violated. He'll tell you the bloody clothes were in my closet. I mean, Otis Jackson is consistent and is very alert and has a certain level of intelligence. At the trial level, Otis Jackson was never called to the stand to testify. The jury never heard that there was another person confessing to this crime and adamantly, vehemently screaming, "Listen to me, you have the wrong guy." So that's number one for me, that they never heard that testimony. And the reason is because he was allegedly found to be incompetent. Now, if you watch that confession, he seems pretty competent to me. So whatever has happened between the initial trial and us seeing this, I don't know, maybe the man was incompetent, or maybe that's what the defense attorneys were told. The second thing is the physical description, like you mentioned, Imam Dawood, is that both officers described the assailant to be 5'9" with cold gray eyes. Imam Jameel towers over 5'9", is 6'5", stands out in a crowd. You can't miss him. He has brown eyes, and the irony is, even on the FBI most wanted poster from all those Cointelpro days, he's listed as 6'5" with brown eyes. If it was Imam Jameel, they know Imam Jameel. You don't work the Atlanta area or in Fulton County and not know who Imam Jamil Al-Amin is. You know he's 6'5", you know he has brown eyes. But their initial description, both officers described him as 5'9", cold gray eyes. Bullet wounds, both officers, and these officers are described as officers who, if they shoot, they don't miss, right? Both of them allege that the assailant was hit by bullets in the exchange. When they picked up Imam Jameel, he had no bullet wounds. He had no injuries. There was absolutely no gunpowder on his person, in his clothing, anything like that. All of this evidence is definitely not there. Yes, Abu Ruya is correct. Otis Jackson does have the wounds, does have the scars. And if you look at the confession, he's about to say, hey, I believe he says, do you want to see my scars? He has the bullet wounds. So there is physical corroborating evidence of this confession. This isn't just an empty confession. There is physical evidence to corroborate it, and they haven't taken the time, A, to investigate it to properly convict the person who committed this crime, and B, it was never brought to the jury. I know Kyrie spoke of the FBI agent Campbell. Agent Campbell is the only person who can establish a complete chain of custody for the evidence in this case. He was present at the crime scene and the arrest site. This is a state case, and that's something I don't think we brought up. Imam Jameel is convicted on the state level through Fulton County in Georgia. He is being held by the federal government in USP Tucson in Arizona. And prior to that, I mean, he was in another federal facility, but prior to that, he was in a supermax facility where he was basically held underground and, you know, in isolation 23 out of 24 hours a day, with the window being at the ceiling of his cell. So the federal government's involvement in this is very different than any other state case, to say the least. So you have an FBI agent, you have a state investigation, it boils down into, it goes from Georgia into Alabama, and the FBI says, I want to come along. And he happens to be the one who finds the weapons. He happens to be the one, when Imam Jameel is captured, to spit on Imam Jameel and to kick him and to treat him inhumanely. Like, these are things that we don't do when somebody is in custody and already handcuffed on the ground. So, I mean, that's definitely an issue, this chain of custody and the ballistics. You know, Bernadette Davy, she was the firearms examiner in this case. Ultimately, Bernadette Davy was fired for breaching protocol, and there were faulty results on several ballistics in several cases. So, you know, there is definitely a reason to believe that the ballistics in this case were faulty. Unfortunately, evidence disappears, right? But at the end of the day, when you're telling me that a bullet case traveled from Alabama to Atlanta and they recovered it from the windshield of the car that was driven all that way, it sounds a bit absurd and it defies logic, if you ask me, right? So, and lastly, Imam Jameel exercised his right not to testify, and that was at the request of his counsel. At that time, I mean, that's very common, that you want to tell somebody who's a defendant in a criminal case, you don't want them to take the stand. They may accidentally incriminate themselves and not realize it. Very common practice. Fifth Amendment right not to take the stand in a criminal case. Imam Jameel chose not to do it. Ultimately, the prosecutor, who was later rewarded with a judge seat after this case was finished, did a mock cross-examination in his closing arguments. And at least one juror, I mean, he did a mock cross-examination, answered as if it was Imam Jameel answering the questions. Imam Jameel never took the case. gross, gross injustice, violation, blatant violation of the Fifth Amendment. And at least one juror says they convicted because they found him guilty because of that closing argument. And I think it's also really important to point out, and this is probably why Kyrie was saying, we never thought that they proved this case. There was no evidence at the scene that tied Imam Jameel to this crime. There was his blood wasn't there. There's no DNA, no gun residue, no fingerprints that would put Imam Jameel at the site of this crime. And at the end of the day, he was targeted. And if you go back to like the FBI agent, who I believe at least, and I think many, many people believe, planted those weapons, you know, they were fingerprintless guns. And this is an FBI agent who in Philadelphia shot a Black man in the back of the head and planted a fingerprintless gun next to him. This was the prosecution's main witness in this initial trial. This trial is shocking to the conscience. It is utterly disgusting. It is an embarrassment to the legal field, to be honest with you. And, you know, just to kind of fast forward, let me try to find it. Give me one moment.
Well, one question as you're continuing, what was the federal government's, what excuse did the feds have to move him out of state custody into federal custody when he was tried in state court? This wasn't a federal case, right? So like, what was your justification for doing that?
Okay, let me tell you, remind me if I forget to go back to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeal and what they said about the initial trial. But it's interesting because right now, and I know I might be going ahead of myself on what we're working on now, but right now our focus is to get him closer to home. Imam Jameel is 78 years old, he's medically fragile. And in doing this request for a transfer, you know, we had to look into a little bit of like, why is he being held at such a high security level facility, and B, what caused that initial transfer? So there is an FBI report, and I recommend, you know, I'm speeding through this, but this book, wait, can y'all see it? Because my screen, hold on a second. This way, this book. Will outline everything that I'm saying to you in more detail because obviously I'm rushing through it. But essentially, there's an FBI report. And I told Kyrie today, I was like, every time I look at this report, I just, you know, everybody's scared of A. Brown, right? But when I read this report, I am scared that these people are in charge of our national security and they write this stuff in reports because their assessment, it's just utterly shocking. Okay, let me find it for you. So Imam Jameel right now is on a management variable, and this management variable goes back to this FBI report, which I believe ultimately was what led to Imam Jameel's transfer from state custody to federal custody. So what they say is that in state custody, they couldn't ensure his safety, you know, like they're doing him a justice by doing this. What state of Georgia taxpayers don't realize is that Georgia pays the federal government every month to house him. So this FBI report says that Imam Jameel was selected by inmate Muslim peers as a leader of the Muslim inmate population in the state of Georgia. There was no intelligence to indicate that Al-Amin proposed to use this pledge to influence an outside community. It was revealed that this request for Al-Amin to become the universal imam was not initiated by Al-Amin. The warden at that time describes him as a quiet inmate that gives them little trouble. Literally, the mission statement of this group was, which was ultimately never formed, was to enjoin and promote virtue and forbid and prevent vice, right? So this was the big threat that they felt like the Muslim prison population statewide wanted to follow him. He never initiated this process. He never asked them to do this. He didn't even accept this position, to be honest with you. So at the end of the day, what they were trying to do, at that time it was post 9/11, they wanted to exercise their right for prayer. There were several issues with the prison system, with the Muslim population not receiving their religious rights, right, under the Constitution. And they wanted him to speak on their behalf. They wanted a leader that maybe would lead prayer. These are basic things. There is no threat. Imam Jameel was never a threat. He is not a threat, even in the current prison that he's being held. So what's interesting is in uncovering all of this, and every time we learn something new, it's just, all of it is absurd. He has a score of 16. So let me explain what this risk score is. So the Bureau of Prisons, the Federal Bureau of Prisons, have a policy where they designate an inmate to a facility as close as practicable to the prisoner's primary residence, and to the extent practicable in a facility within 500 driving miles of that residence. Imam Jameel is well over 500 miles away, right? He is cross country on the other side. And I got to tell you, Tucson is a special place to go. It is far. Kyrie knows how much I love going there. So his risk score is 16, which puts him at a medium level facility. Specifically, male inmates with a score of 16 to 23 are placed in a medium security, which means he's on the lower end of that score spectrum. 24 or above puts him in a high security. Right now, he's housed in a high security with a medium, low, medium score. And it's interesting because he has no, there's no grievances against him. He doesn't fight. He's very peaceful. He's a calm human being. Kyrie, I don't know if I'm quoting you wrong, so if I say it wrong, correct me. So I asked Kyrie, I'm like, what bumped him up to a 16? Why isn't he a low score? Apparently, he told Kyrie to sell something so he could buy some law books. Is this correct? And he was written up for conducting business out of the prison. And that bumped him up from a low level score to a 16, which is a lower medium score, right? But it still doesn't qualify him for the federal level that he's at. And essentially what happens is they put what they call a management variable on him. And this goes to the like cruel and unusual punishment that he endures, okay? So we've been, you know, I'm constantly trying to stalk his medical condition. Like, how are you feeling? What's wrong? Is there anything wrong? And this is a man who doesn't like to complain. So you're like pulling teeth from someone who is clearly suffering medically. And it's like, please tell us what's wrong. So there's this huge delay in him receiving medical treatment, because every time they have to transport him, because of this management variable, they put him in this thing called what he refers to, I don't know if they call it this, the black box. And the black box is when they transport him, he's contained, he's confined, he's chained, he's shackled at his arms, his legs, and his waist. It causes severe pain, and he immediately swells up in his arms and his legs. It's literal torture. And they put this elderly 78-year-old man who's medically needy, who was blinded for an extended period of time because of their negligence, in this black box. And it's just appalling. It's such a violation of his 8th Amendment right to be free from cruel and unusual punishment. So going back, like the things that happened to him and that initial transfer, arguably from state custody to federal custody, it was uncalled for. And arguably in violation of his right to freedom of, to practice religion. He was not doing anything that was a threat to the prison system in the state of Georgia. But there is this little loophole where Georgia can pay the federal government every month to house an inmate if they feel like they can't contain him or if there's some security risk. And that seems to be the default. So I don't know, do you want me to go back to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals? It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, we can go back to it in a moment. I just, as you were talking about, no forensic evidence linking Imam Jameel, Hafizullah Ta'ala, to that, to the gun and the actual confession of the shooter. I was thinking about Imam Luqman's case, and it was a similar situation that you mentioned to the guy who was shot in the head, and the gun was laid next to him. We called it a throw weapon. And when Imam Luqman, rahmatullah alayhi, was killed by the FBI, and they claimed that he had a gun, there was no forensic evidence tying him to the so-called gun he had, meaning that his fingerprints were on the gun. He was shot 20 times. There wasn't a single bit of his blood or DNA on the gun that was next to him because he was bleeding. And then they neglected to do a paraffin test. So there's no forensic evidence to prove that there was any gunpowder right on his hands. None of his DNA on the gun, no fingerprints, no proof of gunpowder. So there's nothing, forensically tying him to that. So it's basically within their playbook to try to basically throw guns on people or say that such and such has a gun. And again, I'm saying to the audience, like, this is not some like weird conspiracy theory that is like we're just dreaming things up. Like, no, like we literally have evidence of real FBI conspiracies to throw cases on people or to make people seem as if they were involved in shooting at or killing law enforcement, when in fact there's no forensic evidence. Just as there's no forensic evidence that links Imam Jamil to a gun, likewise there is no forensic evidence linking Imam Luqman to a gun that so-called shot Freddie the FBI dog, which then they shot him and the Imam 20 times, including shooting him in his genitalia and then also shooting him in his back. Right. So I just want to connect that for you all. And then also, before you go back to the 11th Circuit thing, a decision, but in relationship to Imam Luqman, that in that criminal affidavit in which there was a raid on his masjid and when he was killed, in which there were no less than 3 so-called confidential informants that were part of that. They mentioned Imam Jamil's. They mentioned the relationship between Imam Luqman and Imam Jamil on more than once in a criminal affidavit. Now, this was 2009. Like, Imam Jamil had been in custody of the government for over 8 years, right? And they brought up the Imam's name up, basically trying to criminalize Imam Luqman through his relationship with so-called Black radical leader H. Rat Brown, aka Imam Jamil Al-Amin, convicted cop killer. Like, it's literally the language type that they use in the criminal affidavit in order to justify their murder, right? And also their targeting of a mosque, of the masjid in the west side of Detroit. So I wanted to say that earlier, but just connect the dots between the injustice, the ongoing injustice to Imam Jamil, but how that association was used to target a masjid all the way here in the 313 area code in Detroit that led to the murder of another imam who was close friends with Imam Jamil. So I just needed to mention that. But go ahead, Sister Maha.
And just to interject a little bit, part of the situation in Alabama, which is where the guns were found, they had the story set up for the imam to have been killed, and they actually attempted, to kill him while he was there. The story was that the FBI and my father exchanged gunfire from the woods and from where they were. But when interviewing, all the locals in the area, they stated that there was only gunfire toward the woods. They never saw any gunfire leaving the woods. But again, that was just another way to kind of say, see, we found some guns. He was shooting at us, and that's why, we killed him. But alhamdulillah, none of the bullets that they were firing in his direction hit. And then an actual officer in Alabama, a local police officer in Alabama, who has since passed away, actually gave a statement to my father, like, look, he told him don't move because their intention is to kill you. And so it was a known, not even conspiracy at that point. It was a known fact that any situation that would have allowed for them to shoot him was the goal. He wasn't supposed to be arrested, and that's why the railroad happened in the courtroom, because it was never supposed to make it to a courtroom in the first place.
Yeah, I absolutely believe, Kyrie, your father is alive because it's qadr Allah. Like there is, I don't know how he made it where, but for that officer saying, listen, the FBI wants to kill you, get down and let me take you. We may not even be fighting this fight. So, alhamdulillah for the days that we have to fight this fight, and may he see his freedom. And alhamdulillah for the people on the trial level who testified as to Imam Jamil's character and his impact on the community and the things that he's done for humanity, where he was able to not be looking at the death penalty and because ultimately the government was seeking the death penalty. That's what they wanted in this case. So, every day, alhamdulillah, for another day to be able to fight this fight, But it's true that I've learned in this journey that they can literally demonize anyone and justify their mistreatment and justify their torture to the masses. And it's just this, like I said, this case is just shocking to the conscience. So the 11th, the compassionate release question. We'll get to it. The 11th Circuit Court of Appeal acknowledged prosecutorial misconduct, specifically stating, we regret that we cannot provide Mr. El-Amin relief in the face of prosecutorial misconduct that occurred at his trial. A prosecutor's duty in a criminal proceeding is not to secure a conviction by any means, but to ensure that justice will prevail. The prosecutor at El-Amin's trial failed to live up to that duty. And then it goes on, and the court says the district court failed to consider the most direct evidence of a substantial injurious effect or influence on the verdict. And they go on to discuss the juror's affidavit. But it is not a secret that the higher courts know that there was prosecutorial misconduct by someone who was later given a judge's seat. So it's just, I don't even really know what else to say. Compassionate release. Okay, so right now there are several. Do you want me to go into what's going on right now, Imam?
Yeah, please do.
All right, so there are several things going on. Alhamdulillah, we had a federal case filed to restore Imam Jamil's vision, and kind of just to give a little bit of background information on the uphill battle in this case. He was diagnosed with cataract in 2018. 2017, they were saying that we needed to rule out glaucoma. They basically failed to ever test him for glaucoma between 2017 and 2021 when we filed our case. And that was in federal court, and it was a medical habeas. So since then, the case is still open, but he has received surgery in both eyes. But essentially, he was left blinded, I think, in both eyes for approximately a year before the surgery, but he was definitely blinded for several years in at least one eye. Ultimately, his vision was restored a few months ago. So imagine you have this elderly man. He has multiple myeloma. He has several medical ailments. And on top of that, he could not see. He was falling and bumping into things, couldn't navigate the prison on his own. So these are the ways that they passively torture him. And prior to this case, while he was at Supermax, his medical conditions severely deteriorated. But for this huge uprise socially and this push from the community that something needs to be done, they were basically executing him through medical neglect. And therein lies the problem. You have an elderly man, he's 78, he has multiple diagnoses, and they don't timely, properly treat him. So I'll give you an example right now. While they were under lockdown, he, in the middle of the night, they transferred him from one cell to another. And in his original cell, which he had been for an extended period of time, he maintained a certain level of cleanliness. And in that cell, he maintained it over time. So the new cell happened in the middle of the night. There was a transfer. He ended up developing a skin condition. That is a rash that's spread throughout his body. It's extremely painful on his legs, on his back. He describes it to me as like lesions, and he says it hurts all the way down to his bones. And he's put in several requests. The first request was put in by a nurse at the prison that saw him trying to treat it. and they ignored that request for a dermatologist visit. A year ago, for the entire year, he's been requesting a dermatologist appointment to no avail. These are things that prisoners should not need an attorney to intervene or for us to push and say, when are you doing this? So even with informal intervention on the dermatologist issue, they said, oh, we'll get him an appointment by the end of the year, between November and December. So imagine you have this, this skin condition creating lesions and causing you pain, and you have to wait a year to see a doctor to treat it. It's insane. So essentially, right now, we're working on the transfer. We want him back in Georgia. On the state side, there's the Fulton County Conviction Integrity Unit. We have a new district attorney, Finney Willis, who is actively looking at this case. And what we want is his exoneration. So they can do one of three things. They can either recommend a sentencing reduction, recommend a new trial, or completely exonerate him and free him. The Conviction Integrity Unit is not binded by what the appellate court is binded by, because the appellate court can only look at what has happened at the trial level. Whereas the Conviction Integrity Unit essentially can start all over and look at all of the evidence, even that which was left out of the trial level. So we're hoping this is the most expeditious way for release. Obviously, there are obstacles. Imam Jamil is across the country. There was COVID. People weren't traveling. People weren't going into prisons. We have Otis Jackson, who's in Virginia. They need to speak to him. And, the ballistics are a whole other obstacle, right? But that is our most efficient way to have him released. It is active. It is happening. And on the other side of this state part of this case is the appeal. We were trying to hold off on the appeal because obviously getting a new trial would take more time. The most expeditious way is the Conviction Integrity Unit. But since then, we've been moving forward. There is an appeal, and there's been some development as to how to move forward on that. And the habeas has been filed, and they are moving on that case. So it's twofold. As far as on the federal side, asking for release based on his medical condition, it's an option, but at the end of the day, this is a state case, and we're hoping all of that plays a role through the Conviction Integrity Unit for his expeditious release.
Thank you, Sister Ma. You gave a very thorough explanation of things. As we're wrapping this up, and there are some links down at the bottom, but there's a question that's come through, and I think it's very important. Like, we've gotten like a little tad bit of history. There's a Time magazine article. We definitely need to check that out, or actually buy the Time magazine if you're able to. There's some informational links to click on. We have that scrolling right now. There's been a lot of information that's been given. And of course, the most powerful thing that we can do is to make a dua for Imam Jamil's health and for him to be released from unjust custody. But outside of dua, Brother Kyrie, and this question came up about how or what can we do to help. And I think it's important that you close us out and give us some guidance that, what can the viewers who are watching this live, and also those who will look at this later on, what can we do to help the case of your father, of Imam Jamil?
Well, alhamdulillah, one of those links that you have scrolling across the bottom of the screen, freeimamjamil.com, is a kind of working document. It's being updated very consistently, and it's a list of action items that can be taken that include letter writing. We always have an updated letter writing campaign depending on what it is, that we're trying to accomplish at the time. And so a very easy copy and paste letter writing campaign. There is a button for our launch good donations campaign. There's a button for his merchandise. And I believe there's a link to the Time magazine article as well. We're really pushing that. So that's something else you can do to support, is buy that Time magazine article. But We also have an event coming up, which is a online kind of push for our letter writing campaign featuring Ilyasa Shabazz, which is Malcolm X's daughter, as well as Imam Omar Suleiman, who has been a champion for us for quite some time. He shows up whenever we need him, and that's much appreciated. And the goal is to apply some political pressure to the politicians who are able to assist us in getting the Imam moved closer to Georgia so that he can begin to be an active participant in his in the defense and his inshallah his ultimate exoneration. So that all of that, as well as just spreading the word, we're really alhamdulillah in the home stretch, and the goal is to make the Imam a pop culture figure. And things like Time Magazine and the Al Jazeera spot that we had that did over 1 million views. Those are big steps in the right direction, but every person doing their part to continue to keep the name alive and use those, as tools to inform people. Now you have really credible sources that you can point folks to, as opposed to just pointing them to me. You can send them to Time Magazine, or you can send them to Al Jazeera and let them begin to open their mind to the possibility that conspiracies do exist, as the Imam said. And one of the things I like to say to people on a regular basis on conspiracy, if you don't think they exist, then get indicted for conspiracy, and you'll learn really quickly that it's a real thing, and they take it seriously. And they take it so seriously because they're so good at it. They understand the power that good conspiracies can have on a community as a whole. We talk about Black people as well as smaller communities like ours, like Imam Luqman's. Conspiracies are very real, and they've demonized the word in our community so that we turn up our nose anytime we hear it, and that's unfortunate because we're the target. So know that they're real, know that this is one, and that we need to right the wrong before the Imam doesn't have any time left.
Alhamdulillah. And if I can add on something too that's not on here, actually, I was thinking about my my khutbah topic for tomorrow. This is always an issue for imams and shuyukh, that sometimes we go back and forth about what to talk about for Yom al-Jum'ah. But I think that this conversation has sparked in me a topic for tomorrow. I would also say that for those of you all who are teachers, as well as du'at in our community, when we talk about enjoining good and forbidding evil, and this is part of our topic for khutbah al-Jum'ah, or for talks that we do, in regards to keeping this case alive and keeping the Imam's name alive within our hearts and introducing people to the Imam, I'm also saying right now, I suggest that in our topics on Friday, that we make reference, at least mention the name of Imam Jameel when we talk about this issue of al-amru bil ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar, which is a religious obligation for the Muslim community. It's fardun kifaya to stand for justice. The community has to be organized and to support monetarily those who are on the front lines. So click on that link and give some money on this blessed night. But also, we have the individual obligation, a fardun ayn, that when we are able to, as the Prophet said, alayhi afdalu salam, on the authority of Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, as narrated in Sahih Muslim, that when you see a munkar, that you change it biyadi. I mean, if you have the authority, then you change it with your hand, right? We all know this hadith. If you're not able to, then resist it bilisani, that you have the moral obligation to speak out against it. And if you're not able to speak out against it, then we also, then it says resist in your heart. وَذَلِكَ أَضَفُ الْإِيمَانِ, but this is the weakest of faith. So we as believers in Islam, we don't strive for the lowest common denominator, for the weakest. We at least should use our voices to speak out against injustice. Wow, I'm having problem. Oh, here we go. Let me put this in here because Brother Kyrie sent something that needs to go into the comments. section. Here we go. Regarding sending funds to commissary, that information is right there. It's in the comment section, and I'll put it up here for those of you who can see right there. You can write down this information. It'll also be in the comments when you look later on. If you want to go back to this on YouTube or also on Facebook. Also, an action item, besides you all clicking on the link, what I'd like for you to do is that once this is over, take this link of this discussion in your WhatsApp groups. So first of all, share this on Facebook or Twitter if you have accounts on anti-social media. I got off of social media about a year ago, right? I just can't deal with it. But post it on Facebook and Twitter, or also on your IG. But then on your WhatsApp groups, right? Take the link of this video and share it in the WhatsApp groups that you're on, and encourage people to watch this update regarding the case of our beloved Imam Jamil Al-Amin. Allahumma farj anhu. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala free him and grant him relief. Are there any closing comments, Brother Kairi or Sister Maha, before we conclude?
No, I just wanted to thank you for having us. And, everybody needs to understand that this isn't just Imam Jamil's problem. This is our problem as a community. This is deeply rooted in constitutional violations. And when the government can violate one of our leaders to this extent, imagine what they do to all of the Muslims that are being held. So this case exemplifies cruel and unusual treatment of prisoners across the nation, and we really need to pay attention to that. We have an obligation to them. Just stay informed. Right now, it's very public, like Cointelpro, and the consequences of Cointelpro are real. It's alive and well. There are times where I encounter situations where I just in my mind think, oh, this is Cointelpro reenacted, But Bobby Rush, Representative Bobby Rush, also introduced the Cointelpro Full Disclosure Act, asking that those documents be disclosed publicly, and that there be a library for those documents, so we better understand the history of this country and what has happened. The reality of many of the stories and the fall of many of our leaders, very similar to Imam Jamil, was tied very closely to Cointelpro. So just be aware and understand the injustices, and understand that we have a duty to correct the wrong, as Imam Dawood said. So in closing, I want to thank you, and please keep Imam Jamil in your dua, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. What she said, am I allowed to say that? No, alhamdulillah, I appreciate it as well. Once again, I spoke to my father a little earlier today, and I was able to let him know that I would be on with CARE Michigan. And so he wanted me to make sure I sent my salams, not just to CARE, but to the communities in Michigan as well, especially the Detroit area. That's family. So alhamdulillah, assalamu alaikum to y'all. And again, shukran, please spread the word, continue to spread the word, pick up the magazine, click the link, send the letters. We'll be posting soon, or I'll be posting, at least I think, Maha, you already posted the flyer for the letter writing thing next week on the 13th, I believe.
The letter writing campaign is with Ilyasa Shabazz and Omar Suleiman Saturday. Yeah, this Saturday. Okay. So in 2 days, please show up for it. Please show up for it. But yes, I think Imam Dawood has that flyer also, if you all can post it.
Yes, we'll share it on our social media page as well, inshallah, for those who go to CARE Mission's page. Then we will also share that flyer, inshallah, for that letter writing. Inshallah, for those.
Oops.
Okay.
I'm on Care Michigan's page, and we went live on my phone. I'm sorry.
Okay. I thought the feds had messed around, had given a secret. They messed up their recording process right there.
I'm over here trying to follow instructions and share it to my Facebook, and it started playing. So I'll wait till we finish. We're wrapping up.
Okay, inshallah. So inshallah, we will close with the dua. And thank you all very much for coming, and please share the links and the information regarding this case. Allahumma lakal hamdu fasalli ala Muhammadin wa ala ali Muhammadin wa sallam. Allahumma ansur al-Imam Jamil Al-Amin. Allahumma faraj anhu. Allahumma faraj anhu. Allahumma faraj anhu. Ya Allah, we ask you to give your divine assistance to Imam Jamil Al-Amin. Ya Allah, we ask you to grant him speedy relief, Ya Rabb Al-Amin. We ask you, Ya Allah, to grant him and all of his loved ones al-afiyat fi dini wa dunya wa akhirah. Ya Allah, we ask you to free all political prisoners in the United States of America, to free Mumia Abu Jamal, to free Dr. Afia Siddiqui, to free all of our brothers and sisters who are languishing in CMU units and Supermax, Ya Rabbil Alameen. We ask you, Ya Allah, Ya Allah, Ya Allah, to grant strength to all of the legal counsel and legal team for Imam Jamil Al-Amin's case, Ya Allah. Ya Allah, protect them from the harm of the shayateen min al-jinni wal-ins, Ya Rab. Protect them from harm from the Satans amongst the jinn and the men, Ya Allah. Protect them from the devils amongst the jinn and the men, Ya Rabbil Alameen. We ask you, Ya Allah, to make us be firm on La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and make us be of those people that when we see injustice, that we speak out against it, Ya Allah, and not just resist it in our hearts. Ya Rabbil Alameen, Ya Hanan, Ya Manan, Ya Badi' as-samawati wal-ard, Ya Dhul Jalali Ikram, Ya Hayyun Ya Qayyum, bi rahmatika nastaghith. Ya Hayyun Ya Qayyum, bi rahmatika nastaghith. Ya Hayyun Ya Qayyum, bi rahmatika nastaghith. سبحان ربك بالعزة عما يصفون والسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. الفاتحة. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.